This is a demo of the ebWASP project. First, we assume there are three roles. One is a system administrator, and the system administrator is in charge of running the different workflows. In this case, there are many workflows, but two workflows are of interest to us. One is called ebWASP receive and one invoice, and the other one is called ebWASP send invoice. So in this demo, we assume the administrator has launched the invoice. So to launch a workflow, for example, the send invoice, you go to actions and then you click start process instance. So that will launch the workflow for the sending of invoices. And then to launch the receive invoice workflow, we go to the ebWASP receive invoice workflow and start actions and then start process instance. So you can see now there are two instances running, one of the send invoice and one of the receive invoice. Now we have two users. One is the seller and one is the buyer. And as you can see, when these both workflows are launched, the task that appears for the seller is to say that they are ready to log in into the system to carry out any of their actions. Before we go into this task, we can show you the screen of the buyer. And the buyer also, in this case, has a task that says ready to log in. Okay, so now we go into the menu of the seller and the seller starts their task. And then in their task, you could see that they have to log in by giving their credentials. So the sender in this case will choose their credentials from a drop-down list. In this case, it's ESS. And when they click save, they move to the next stage in the workflow. And in the workflow, the only action that the workflow allows them to do is to send a message. So if I click start task, then we could see that there are 5 messages that could be sent by the workflow. Let's assume the sender wants to send the first invoice, which is invoice 7, clicks on the row, and then click save. And after we've selected, you can see there is another task that comes to the sender. And then when you start this task, it shows you the details of the invoice. In this case, for example, you can see that it's a UBL invoice that we want to send to a receiver called AWO, and that it's ready to be sent. So the seller can click confirm and then click save, and then by clicking confirm, they know that the invoice has been sent. So now we go to the buyer. So the buyer goes through the same process. They start a task first to give their credentials. Remember that invoice was sent to a buyer called AWO. And in this case, we assume the buyer gets into the workflow by giving the name. So when you click save, a new task gets sent to the buyer, and the buyer will then see that they have received an invoice 7 from the seller. They can then click on this invoice, and by clicking save, they select that this is the invoice they want to see, and now they can confirm by another task, and then they can look at the details and confirm and then save the invoice. And you can see now that the buyer gets another task to approve the invoice, But if you go back to the sender, who's the seller, you could see that the last status they had was that it was sent. If they start this task and they do a refresh, the status will have changed, that the invoice has been received by the buyer. So far, that's what the seller gets notified about. Before we move on to the actions of the seller, the administrator has a dashboard where they can see the progress of the workflow. So in this case, the workflow that we have executed is the sender workflow, and you can see that it went through selecting the sender, selecting which message to send, and after that confirming which message has been sent, and the notification has been that the receiver has received the message. Now, let's go back to the buyer, and the buyer is in the stage of approving the invoice. So in this case, the buyer starts a task, then looks at the content of the invoice and decides to approve the invoice. And after it has approved the invoice, you could see that there is another task to pay the invoice. On the buyer side, it's not the same people that have to do the invoice buying and approving. It could be different people in different departments, but in this case, it's the same person that has to do it. So you can see now that the status of the workflow has changed, and then the seller can, the workflow of the seller is reached the stage where the invoice is approved. Now the user, the seller, if they refresh their status, so if you click Start Task, they can see that the approved response has been received, and then the status is now approved. And if the seller refreshes, then it will still stay approved because the buyer hasn't paid the invoice yet. So now if you go to the buyer, and the buyer has to pay the invoice, and in this case we assume the buyer has paid the invoice, they click Save, and then the buyer has only one task to say that they has been paid, and if they save that, you can see the buyer has no more tasks to perform. So now if we go to the seller at this stage has the response that it has been approved. So if they do a refresh by starting the task and doing a refresh, then you can see that the paid response has been received. And if they just acknowledge this task and save again, you can see that the seller doesn't have any more tasks to perform.